Makes too much noise.
Welcome
Oh, it's good to be here.
to welcome to episode 275 of the Flying Free podcast. So today we have something a little bit different for everyone. Usually we interview female survivors of abuse, but today we're going to hear from a man who will be sharing his experiences of abuse in his family of origin and his religious environment. But he's also going to offer some ideas for how to recognize the differences between safe churches and unsafe churches. Our guest is Ryan George. He's the author of Hurt and Healed by the Church, as well as a book called Scared to Life. He's the blogger behind explorience.org, very clever. He co-founded and co-leads Dude Group. So
right.
I don't think any of us are, those of us women are probably, we're not allowed to come to Dude Group. Is that true? Is this only
Maybe
for
maybe
guys?
on a special night, but yeah, last night there was 14 of us around the fire till about midnight.
Oh, wow. That's so cool. It's a spiritual adventure community in the Blue Ridge Mountains where he lives with his wife, Crystal, and his daughter. Is it Diani or
It
Dioni?
is. Way to go.
Diani?
You got it on the first guess. You're the first
Okay.
podcaster to get it right.
Oh, wow. Diani. Okay. That's a beautiful name.
It is. And her middle name is Zageisha. So it's Diani Zageisha, which is just beautiful.
Oh my gosh. That is. So, how did you guys come about naming her that?
Oh, we did not. She came to live
What's
with us when she was 15. I was actually on a helicopter expedition up in British Columbia, and I get back to civilization and cell phone reception, and I had a text from my wife saying, "Oh, by the way, law enforcement put a young lady in our care for this safety. We weren't trying to be foster parents. We weren't trying to adopt. I'd had all three versions of a vasectomy, trying not to become a dad. But
Wow.
God had different plans, and 893 days later, we actually adopted her. And the judge said, this is a beautiful thing." But the judge we had before that was like, "I don't even know what to do with this. I've never had an adoption folder with this many documents in it, and I don't understand how this works. Like, we've never had an adoption where it followed the pattern that it did in your all's life."
Wow. That is an incredible story.
And now she's trained. She's a junior. She's trained to be a social worker so she can go help other kids who were in the situation where she was.
That's amazing.
It's
I bet
beautiful.
that changed your life too, to be a dad.
Utterly. My therapist one time asked me, she said, "Do you realize, Ryan, like almost all of your huge breakthroughs here in my office have happened through the filter of you becoming a dad? Like all the abuse
Wow.
that you had as a kid, all the stuff that you had to figure out, that you were finally able to use the right language to describe it. You were finally able to talk about it in the appropriately healthy way once you became a dad," which is something I fought against for 18 years of marriage.
Wow. So did your wife want to have kids or did she feel the same way as you did?
She wanted to have kids for sure. I throughout our marriage that became a sticking point, as you can imagine. Those are two very different ends of the spectrum. There's
Yeah.
no compromise. It's a one and a zero computationally between
Yeah,
kids and no kids.
exactly.
And so I guess we frame it now as I won it for the first 18 years and she won it for the rest of our life. And I'm thankful she
Oh,
won. So
wow. That is really, really neat. Okay, so let's back this up a little bit and start at the beginning of your life.
mm,
You've let me know on the back end that the first 20 years of your life you grew up going to several independent fundamental Baptist churches. We're gonna from now on in this podcast we'll just call that this IFB
thank you.
churches.
It's a lot easier
And
to do
yeah,
that.
and including one where your dad was actually the pastor. So why don't you tell us about that experience?
Several actually. Most of the churches I attended growing up, my dad was either the assistant pastor or the main pastor.
Oh, okay.
So I was actually, my father was Catholic, my mother was Lutheran when they got married. They fought over that. So I was christened a Catholic. And then about 4 years into my life, they joined this IFB cult. And then they got rebaptized. And then I got baptized after vacation Bible school where we had a live lamb in the foyer. I remember being so enamored that we had a sheep inside the church. And then for the next, 18, 19, 20 years of my life, I went to IFB schools, IFB churches, and IFB college. Um, and yes, I was indoctrinated with the stuff. Have you seen Shiny Happy People? There's a man that's mentioned often, Bill Gothard. We were familiar with his materials. I was trained in them. I remember his books in our home. So if you have that as a framework, that's a shorthand for what I grew up in.
Yeah. I grew up in the same environment, so I know
Okay.
exactly what you're talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um, so your father was your father abusive? Was he abusive in the home? And like describe how what your father's style of abuse.
So it depended on the victim, right? So for me, it was a lot of verbal abuse, a lot of physical. My dad hung me. My dad would use, I remember one time it was like 32 degrees below Fahrenheit, and he put me outside to freeze me to change my attitude. He would throw me. I went through a wall one time. I mean, very physical, threatening to knock my teeth out. And then he would use scripture to say, hey, in the Old Testament, we would have been allowed to stone you. So you should be thankful you're even alive. Like
Oh
it's
my
just a loving
gosh.
way to come at it. So for me, it was physical. With my sisters and my brother, he was not physical. He would it'd be emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, and then as you've probably heard, it's in different podcasts or whatever. It's definitely throughout my book. Is we found out my dad was a serial sexual predator, and what he was doing outside our home was and grievous in a different way than what he was doing to us. We're not quite sure how many victims he had. We know there's more than the ones that we know already, but we don't know when it started. I moved around a lot as a kid. My dad would like just up and leave a church, and we would move. One of the churches, he and my mom were the half of the school teachers. We had four teachers in the school, and my mom and dad were two of them. In the middle of the day in November, we just up and moved to another state, and the church where we were paid my dad for like 12, 16, 18 months, something like that, is going away money to get a church started in Maryland, which is where a lot of his victims were. So, but we don't know. Was it before that? Was it, did it go back to Tennessee? We don't know. When the victim zero for us, or victim one that we know about by name, there's two witnesses that heard my mom say when she was presented with it, oh, not again. So I don't know what comes before, oh, not again.
So I'm curious, was your mom was she aware did she also experience his abuse? Was she aware that he was like hurting you physically and sexually abusing
Sh
people outside of your family?
I don't know what she knew about outside of our family. It was impossible to miss what was going on inside our home. I mean,
Okay.
I was the oldest. I took the brunt of it. I pushed back on us being homeschooled. I pushed back on a lot of things. And that's one of the strange things. Like I try to explain to people, the nuance of my dad is up until I was old enough to have a voice. My dad was, I mean, it was a model dad. Like I don't have any complaints. My therapist has asked me, like, surely do you have some memories of, and I said, no, I remember I beat him in a foot race on his 40th birthday. I showed him up. And that it was like I ushered in an era of verbal and physical abuse after that. My dad was kind. I did get spanked as a kid, but it wasn't like how you see it presented. It was always my dad would be a long time to wait. He would come in, he would be calm about it. It was never in anger. I remember one time I got so scared I got a bloody nose and he said, oh, you've already suffered enough. Another time I got in there and he handed me the belt and he said, hey, I want you to spank me for your crime. And I couldn't do it. I was crying. He's like, yeah, I hate doing this. So don't make me do it anymore. And I think that was my last spanking, actually. So he was very, I mean, it's still not right as we know about spanking, but it was much kinder and it wasn't presented as an abusive thing until I started pushing back on his theology, on the rules in our house, et cetera. As I pushed back verbally, it came back physically to me.
Okay, so how old were you about when you started pushing
Yeah,
back?
eighth grade. So I left Christian
Okay.
school. I was getting bullied a lot in Christian school. And it was about I finished seventh grade and then we started eighth grade. Now it's about the time that things started to get rough with my dad.
Okay, so when did the truth come out? Like what happened? How did that all unfold?
About his other victims as well. So it's interesting now. I mean, we're putting pieces together, right? And actually, in book promotion, I have a phone call to make. I've been, advertising this book, and I had a guy that went to my dad's church said, "Hey, I got more information. If you want it, give me a call." So I'm about to learn more here in the next week or so whenever I connect with him. But the first clue I didn't realize was a clue was back in the '90s. So, as you know, in IFB churches, they're really big on that door-to-door visitation, canvassing your
Yep.
neighborhood. And I was actually canvassing with my mom one time. There's a Cracker Barrel now where we were, but and the lady on the other side of the door, we're like, "Hey, do you have a faith? Do you have a church? We'd love to invite you to ours." And she said, "Well, where do you go to church?" And we gave her the name of the church, and she said, "Oh, I would never go there. The pastor's having an affair." And my mom's like, "I'm
Oh
his
my
wife. I would know."
gosh.
And the lady, I still remember this. I've never met this lady again. I don't even know her name. She's a stranger on the other side of the door. And she looked at my mom and she says, "Ma'am, you don't know your husband." And that didn't make any sense to me because I didn't have any other category for it. So then fast forward to 2001, 2002. I should know the date, but it's weird how trauma affects your memory.
Yeah.
We lived out in Indiana, my wife and I got a call from my dad saying he had been unfaithful to my mom with a 19-year-old who was, I was married in my 20s, so it was younger than me. One of my sister's really good friends. And he called it an affair that started after she turned 18. We learned later, I'll get to that, that that wasn't true. So I just thought my dad had made some mistakes, and he wasn't verbally abusive to me anymore because now as a man, I had my own home. So I just thought it was like this phase my dad was in. And he didn't physically abuse my sisters or my brother. So we were like, man, something's up. So then 2012, so my wife is the missions director at our church. She's bilingual. She grew up in South America. And she takes counselors from up here in the States down to work with women who are coming out of sex trafficking to counsel and help them. They do microloans, help them start new businesses. But one of the things she says is to the people who volunteer from America to go down is, hey, if you have any sexual trauma in your past, let's talk about it now because I'd much rather have that conversation here than when we're down there. And in one of those pre-trip planning meetings, one of my dad's victims is like, "Yeah, Ryan's dad on multiple occasions." And in fact, my dad would molest her, and then in front of her, he would pray and ask God for forgiveness, and then tell her, "Look, God's forgiven me, so you don't need to tell anybody. Just be gossip now," which is horrible. It's spiritual abuse on top of everything else. And so I went up with that victim came to me, my little sister's friend. She's like, "Hey, would you mind going up to talk to your dad with me?" Which is a huge honor, right? To be trusted as the assailant's son to go with her. And now she's named a kid after me. Some of my handwriting is tattooed on her arm. Like we created this great friendship because I was an advocate and an ally for her in a crucial moment. But my dad negotiated with her and with me that we wouldn't tell her family or mine. And I had talked to different people and like, hey, you got to honor the victim's story. You can't tell it until she's ready to tell it. So I carried that secret for years, going to family Christmases and 4th of July's and whatever else. And then 6 Christmases later, was it Christmas? It was anyway, there was some gathering, holiday gathering at my parents' house. My wife overheard my dad talking to two young girls. So my parents have a pool and they've got like I think like 18 people can sleep in their house. Like there's multiple living rooms, there's toys. I mean, there's people there that aren't related to us, coming in and out. And my wife found my dad talking to a 9-year-old and 11-year-old about how the women in Song of Solomon were praised for their body parts. And my wife just like, wait, what? And so she alerted their parents, but again, because they didn't know what I knew from 2012, they didn't know what I knew from,
Sure.
1998. So for them, it was like, well, that doesn't make sense with the Pastor George we know. And then the big where like we all started to finally put all the pieces together and everyone decided to start telling their story. There was a podcast dropped in 2021 of that girl, supposedly 19-year-old girl that my dad had quote unquote had an affair with. Turns out it started before she was 18. It was non-consensual. It was gross. She had a receipt. She had love letters from him, jewelry, this whole big thing. Um, and so I reached out to her. I was like, "Hey, I didn't know. I'm so sorry. Like, is there anything I can do?" I talked to her lawyer. I've talked to law enforcement. Yeah, we don't know the extent of it. Eh, Not that there has to be any more for it to be grievous, right? It's just a horrible thing.
So there has he been convicted? Is he like what happened
Mhm.
with he's
Uh,
still
s-
out there?
yeah. So the one on the podcast I talked to the lawyer, we're now past the statute of limitations. And so
Oh
that he's
Lord.
safe there. In fact, the attorney told me when we got off the phone. I mean, I tried to answer any question. I said I have no problem putting my dad behind bars. Like he's gross. But he said, and I'll never forget this. He said, "Man, your dad was so slick. Like it's just crazy." As we talked about it, it seemed like my dad knew someday this was going to come. The other victim has chosen not to. The statute of limitations hasn't run out on her. But she said, "I don't need that for my healing," and she's living a beautiful life now. So like she's living proof of that's true. Um, she has boundaries around him. Like he's not allowed at my house. He's not allowed at my sister's house. So she doesn't have to see him when she comes and visits, people who are related to me. And he wouldn't have a reason necessarily to go to her house. So yeah, he's in limbo. He doesn't have many friends. He stays at home watching Korean TV shows and he works from home. It's a pretty lonely life. He's in a hell of his own.
Are your parents still married? What happened to your mom?
Yeah, she is. My dad built a like her own bedroom suite on the other side of this massive. They had restored this massive old house. It's really pretty on the inside, actually. And he built her own whole thing. So she's got one side of that. She runs his business. So they got to work together, in her mind. I still see her from time to time. I don't have boundaries around her.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, she's condoned the abuse. She's told my sister, Ryan deserved to be abused for telling his story now. And so that's a little
Oh,
harsh, but my mom wasn't physically abusive, and I don't remember verbal more than just, a mom getting upset on an occasion, but nothing physical or definitely not sexual or anything like that. But she told us, she said, I stayed with your dad after 2002 for the kids, and then I'm staying with him now for the grandkids.
well, I hope the grandkids are safe.
Uh,
Because
most of
people
them
like
are.
that don't change.
That's my opinion as well.
Oh my gosh. I have so many thoughts and I need to like bite my tongue right now.
No, you're good.
Um,
But no,
oh,
most of my family agrees with you. I mean, I haven't seen my dad since a wedding I officiated 3.5 years ago. It was right after the first open COVID thing. A couple got married, and he was there. But I am going to see him at a funeral here in a few weeks. And my sisters, I mean, they're friends with both of the victims that I know about, and obviously those kids, because those kids were part of. It's just like other grandkids, like it's all these kids running around, so we know everybody's kids. And they're like, they in advance told my dad, don't come talk to us. You're not welcome around our kids for sure, and not around
yeah.
us. Um, my wife loves to speak truth to power. She's done it a lot in some crucial moments, and so she's like, yeah, let him talk to me. But the rest of us we've put boundaries around my dad. I think half my siblings have him blocked on their phones. I do as well.
Okay. Well, okay. So one of the things that we were going to talk about is silence and how that actually perpetuates
Mhm.
abuse and it
Mhm.
keeps it thriving. It's like how I describe it is like mold grows and thrives in dark places. If you can just keep it out of the sun and in a nice, moist, dark place, it'll just grow and thrive and proliferate. But if you expose it to dry air and the sun, then it will die. But you have to, expose it.
That's a
Um,
great metaphor.
yeah. So what ne- in your opinion, what needs to happen for pastors and church? Like your dad is not the only one. This is like an epidemic that, I mean, there are so many stories. You've probably seen it, in the news. I feel like every month there's some new story is coming to light about some pastor who has been molesting people or doing things behind the scenes. And it doesn't even have to be that dramatic as far as, I think that there are a lot of religious leaders that hide behind their persona as a pastor who are just very spiritually and emotionally abusive behind the scenes to their family or even to the people on the staff of their church,
Hmm.
and using God and the Bible and their position to manipulate and coerce other people into letting things go, not
Hmm.
speaking out, forgive and forget. Let's move on. Let's not have a spirit of bitterness. Our heart is deceitful above all else, and who can know it?
Dude, you're
Um,
quoting all the hits.
yeah, exactly. So, well, I've been marinating in this my entire life as well. So, um, I'm totally tracking with you on and where you're coming from. What do you think needs to happen for them to be held more accountable for their past abuse? Like when you talk about your dad, I feel like he really hasn't been held accountable for his actions or his behaviors at all. And he is I believe as a sexual predator, he is a danger
Hmm.
to children and he's a danger to everyone around
Hmm.
him. It sounds like you guys understand that, but he's still out there walking around even though he acts like a recluse. Are people still coming over to his house or not
No,
anymore?
no, no.
Oh,
He's
that's
complete.
good.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He It's interesting because a lot of their friends, my parents' friends, haven't seen the podcast, don't know the mojo. My book might be the first time that, and this, sharing this kind of videos on Facebook and Instagram might be the first time they hear about it. I had to go up and tell my dad's family before I'd started the book tour. I was like, hey, I owe you guys this. you need to know this before. I don't want you to learn about this from Facebook. I want you to learn about it from me, and I want you to be able to ask any questions that you have.
Yeah.
And it happened because my cousins, they are athletes and they married attractive young women and they've had beautiful kids. And my dad went up to visit them, and I saw that, and I texted my cousin. I was like, dude, I can't tell you I love you and your family if I don't tell you. Like, this is the backstory on my dad. And we got receipts. If you want the links, here's the links. Like, um, yeah, I think now the more light we shine on my dad specifically, the more he's become reclusive, and so he's behaving, if you will. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean I don't think he's healed. I don't. We tried to get my dad to get help. So the first thing my wife did alone, she went to him. They were the only two people in the space, and she says, "Hey, Dad," or Tim or whatever she called him. She's like, "With I think really what you have is a problem. Why don't you go to like a Celebrate Recovery or something like that?" And he's like, "Nah, you're not a legitimate member of our family, so I'm not going to listen." Like, that was his response. So then I went to him and I said, and I got my sisters to sign off on this. I was like, I want to create some boundaries. They peeled a couple of the boundaries I wanted to put in there, but I said, for you to have access to us, if you want to be our dad, here's all the things that we need you to do. We need you to turn yourself in. We need you to tell your pastor. My dad, for years, was participating in a ministry called Pulpit Helps. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but like small or rural churches where they only have one pastor. When the pastor goes on vacation, they don't have anybody, right? And so what they do is they have a like-minded pastor. It's almost like a circuit riding preacher that comes in and fills the pulpit. Well, my dad was doing that all over the state of Maryland, maybe in other states as well. My dad got fired from the Baltimore Rescue Mission for inappropriate comments about Beyonce or something. But anyway, we said, you got to go tell all these ministries where you filled in. You need to get into therapy. You need to get into counseling. Like all this kind of stuff. And he said, none of them, zero. I'm not touching it. So what we thought was having a relationship with us would be enough of incentive. We tried the carrot first,
Yeah.
and then of course I've talked to the detective in his county, and I've talked to attorney. Like, we're hamstrung on the law situation, right? Like, I can't make it happen, and I don't. I want justice for my dad, if only for closure for his victims, to see some sort of
Yeah.
justice being done. But statute of limitations is statute of limitations. I mean, it's and now Maryland has, if it had been like, they have all these rules, like there's an unlimited statute of limitations if it was like one of your children or something like that, right? Like they have, if it's a guardian or I can't remember what the language is. But these were girls that went to his church, right? So, and he groomed, he knew like one of his victims, her dad had committed suicide. So obviously she has a hole in her heart for a father figure, and he exploited that. Um, yeah, I
Well,
don't, go ahead.
hopefully you're telling your story and getting it out there and speaking the truth will, you never know.
Mhm.
Someone might decide to get brave and come forward and
And that's
hold him
part of the hope.
accountable.
I'm not writing this book to get a pound of flesh on my dad. I'm not writing this book for the justice. What I'm hoping is that by shining light on the causes of how it happened, and I think most of the causes of what happened in my family, through my dad, through the churches we grew up, it happened. Obviously, these people all went to the same church as I did, or at least they did during this period of time. That it's actually a theology problem. So if I can shine light on the wrong beliefs that lead to wrong actions, if I can shine light on how these guys, the tactics they use to hide. I talk in the book about like how my dad got other pastors to cover for him. Um, if we shine, like what you said, I loved your analogy. Like, if we shine enough light in there, that maybe I can't do anything for my dad's direct victims, but maybe I can do something for people who have a story that they need to tell.
Yeah.
My book coach, when I started writing this, I remember, she's in Tennessee, sweet lady, and she had moist eyes and almost like a choked up voice. And she looked at me through Zoom and she says, Ryan, do you realize if you do what we're trying to do with this book, you might free women you don't even know?
Yeah. Oh,
And I got choked up, and
absolutely.
I was like, yeah, sign me up. Like, where do I sign?
Yep. Yep. Everything we do has a ripple effect.
Hopefully.
And I do believe that every time we tell the truth, that we come out and we break that silence, it sets people free. A
Mm.
lot of people free. Yes, that we don't even always know. Okay, so looking back, what are some of the red flags that you feel like you missed about the IFB churches that you grew up attending?
I think it's bigger than IFB churches, to be honest.
Well, yeah, I do
But
too.
um, so three of the red flags that I've noticed in retrospect, and I don't remember, I quote him in my book, I don't remember who it was, is you have to be careful of a church that only confesses the sins of other people and not their own.
Mm,
And my dad would do that a lot. My dad excommunicated a guy for having an affair, which at least is between consensual adults, but then didn't confess his own sins, right? So, if you go into a place and you never hear someone in leadership say, I was wrong about that, it may not be something gross and like sinful, but just say, hey, I was wrong about this. I got this wrong. I regret. If you never hear them, it's like Donald Trump says, I've never asked for forgiveness for anything, which is a huge red flag. I mean,
yes.
if you've never asked for forgiveness. Another is, and you know this, I don't know what the percentage is, but it seems like the majority of presentations in IFB churches are angry. There's anger, there's angst. They tend to, just like Trump again, they tend to dehumanize the victims, or they dehumanize the people who disagree with them. They're, if you don't read a King James Bible, you're going to hell. Like that's not
Yep.
an exaggeration. That's an actual thing that's being presented out there. The other thing, this sounds really funny, but an American flag in a sanctuary is a red flag to me. If I see an
Hmm.
American flag in a sanctuary, I'm not coming back. Because that Christian nationalism, and 81% of white evangelical men voted for a serial rapist who's bragged about looking at teenage girls naked and wanting to have sex with his own daughter. If you can look past that and slap
Yes.
God on it and sell a Bible with his name on it or whatever, that's a huge red flag for me. I'm a kingdom over country guy, and I've been to 30 countries, all seven continents, both polar circles. Jesus is not American. I've
Yes.
gone in church in
Amen.
5 different continents. I attended a church up in Canada once that had 86 or 83 nationalities in the church. My wife and I used to
Wow.
serve in a church here that had 14 different countries represented by the people there. And what you realize is uh, an American centric Jesus is not is not Jesus of Nazareth.
No, no. I'm so glad you said that. We don't really get I don't think we've ever gotten political on this podcast. But I feel as time goes by, I feel like that's another thing that we need to just start speaking out about, because it's another form of abuse and control and coercion that's happening on a national level.
And it gets so bad. I mean, this is documented. I'm not making this up. There's a church in San Antonio that they were doing a freedom tour or something like that. And there's all kinds of red flags about that tour. But one of, like, in the church, and they gave half off tickets to pastors. They were chanting, "Let's go, Brandon," in the church. There's
Wow.
a pastor, I think in Tennessee or Alabama, it makes sense. But he was saying, hey, after Biden got elected, and I'm not a big fan of Biden, I'm not like political here, partisan,
Yeah.
but he's like, hey, if assassination is part of God's will, who am I to get in the way of God's will? And you're just like, whoa.
Unbelievable.
So when you have, my wife says, and there's no hard numbers here, but if 30 to 40% of the women in your church have some sort of sexual trauma, assault, molestation, aggression, whatever it is, and then they got to walk past cars that have a certain name on a bumper sticker or a window sticker, and they're going, there's cognitive dissonance in this building. I am not going to be
Yes.
safe in this building. And
Yes.
so one of the things we've been attending the same church for 18 years. I don't remember an American flag ever being in our sanctuary. I think one time or a couple times on 4th of July, like they put it up waving on like the screens, like happy 4th of July or whatever, but
Yeah.
not the jingoist, America first, American exceptionalism message. And you
Yep.
wouldn't think that's tied to sexuality. And I would have said before the Trump presidency, I wouldn't have connected that. But when you look at how many things, I mean, this stuff that's going to be coming out here shortly, the documents about him and Epstein, it's gross. Like the article that I just saw yesterday, maybe it was Monday, on the madam that he hired in 1998 to bring him teenagers. It's like, so if you get behind that, when you had other choices, right? Roe v. Wade has already been overturned. There were already people of faith in your primary ballot, and you still chose him, and you still put his name in the back of your vehicles. You're telling the women in your church that you're going to overlook, and you're willing to look rape,
Yep.
incest, abuse,
Yep.
whatever else.
You're
So
willing to normalize that
right, it goes
and accept
beyond a
it.
political statement to a sexual ethic.
Yeah. It's all tied into patriarchy as well, which
Mhm.
is yeah, which is a whole nother, well, it really is what we're talking about, honestly.
Which is why I went back and listened to a couple episodes of your podcast to prepare for this interview, and I kept scrolling trying to find another dude. Right, I'm just not. My publicist told me when I was working, she's like, one of the things we've got going for you, Ryan, is there aren't a lot of dudes saying what you're saying on
Yep.
podcasts these days.
Yep. But yeah, Andrew Bauman has been on here a couple
Mhm.
times. He's someone, but yeah, I don't really interview men. And honestly, when I do accept an interview, I mean, one of the reasons why I accepted this interview with you is because I could tell from your background that you had experienced a lot of things that a lot of women have experienced, that,
Mm,
and they're telling the story. Whereas a
mhm.
lot of men, they don't really, they kind of think that it's like normal. They, or they're
Mhm.
not talking about it, or I don't know. It serves them to be in that kind of environment, I
It does.
guess,
Hmm.
right? So they're not, so they like, I mean, they like it. They're fine with it. They're not experiencing the fallout of it. But as a child, you experienced the horror of it. And then you saw, firsthand. And then I love how you're an eighth grader and then you decide to push back a little bit. And then
Yeah,
you get
that's
the,
when I was taller than my dad. I was never. I don't know if I've ever been stronger than my dad in my life. My dad's quite strong, man. But that was when I was taller and faster than him.
yeah, well, you become a this is just a law of nature. If you're going to be a truth teller, you're going to get slammed for it.
Hmm.
The abusive people hate truth tellers,
Hmm.
and I just feel like when you start telling the truth, you get, I mean, I was excommunicated from my church for telling the truth. And also my family of origin doesn't have anything to do with me anymore. But then so all of this toxic environment falls away and you find yourself making relationships and building a new community with people who aren't involved in that toxic thinking. And it is incredible. I didn't even know that there were healthy environments, that they existed,
Hmm.
because when you grow up in that kind of environment,
That's all you know.
that's all you know. It just feels normal. And then it's very typical for kids to grow up and then they end up marrying someone
Hmm.
who also perpetuates that familiar feeling. So, yeah. Okay. So, let's see. You and your wife now attend a non-denominational church.
Hmm.
So, I think that's important to just make note, because a lot of people who have deconstructed or have come out of abusive church environments, like I have, I don't even attend church anymore. I've chosen not to. It's not that I'm not open to going to a church one day. It's just that for me, for now, this is what feels good for me right now.
Hmm.
And it feels healing and it feels like I needed that space.
Hmm.
But some people find a healthy church and continue to love it. And some of my kids go to church and love it. And some of my kids don't go to church anymore. Um, how did finding a healthy church help you discover what you now truly believe?
Oh, several things, and I think it's because of the not that my church has anything special or not non-denominational churches have anything special, but my very specific assembly, like that specific group of people, had a makeup of people uh, within it. Some of them are still there, 18. I've been going there for 18 years. Some of them have moved on to other churches or moved on to other states, but they were living the life that I was never told was possible. Like I saw people who love Jesus in a way I've never met. When you look at Jesus in the Gospels, everybody from any end of any spectrum, so Jew and Gentile, old and young, male and female, rich and poor, religious and non-religious, everybody was fascinated by that guy. And
Yeah.
we're told that it wasn't because he was super handsome or anything. Like he was a normal looking, he said you wouldn't pick him out of a crowd.
Yeah.
And so I bumped into a bunch of people like that who were also living lives. So I have pastors who, for jollies, fly experimental aircraft, race motorcycles, ice climb, whitewater paddle, like a lot of the adrenaline stuff that I do, backpacking stuff that I do with people from my church, and some of them I do with my pastors. And so they were on a grand adventure that I always wanted, right? I mean,
Mm.
I'd always dreamed of, I didn't know that specifically was what I was wanting to do. And so I had people in my church were like, "Hey, do you want to go power paragliding today after church?" Like it's just not a normal thing, right? And
Yeah.
the way
No.
I'm wired, I'm wired for adrenaline, and it's addictive, right? It is, people say an adrenaline junkie. It is. If I don't have it after a certain amount of time, it's probably similar to someone who hasn't had alcohol or their drug of choice or whatever. But I had all these guys, and then we would before, during, and after these things, we would process it through the filter of faith. So like one of my pastors used to be a wilderness guide. He has a master's in experiential education and a doctorate in ethnography, which is where you study subgroups of people to figure out culture. And so we'd be out in the middle of the wilderness. He's like, all right, you just did something, ice climber, whatever it was. You just did something you've never done. You never thought you could do. You were scared. You were shaking. You got past it. What's something back home in your faith, in a relationship or whatever that you're scared of that maybe that line is arbitrary there as well? And so I was
Wow.
discipled in a very almost like Jesus was discipled while he's walking down the road. He's like, hey, check out
Yeah.
this tree or check out this fish or whatever. So I fell into an assembly where not only was our pastor trained in it at a doctoral level, but they practiced it. Like one of my pastors, he was the guy who was on stage this past Sunday. Um, he whitewater kayaks in the dark in class 5 rapids, which is nuts.
Oh my
Growing
God.
up, he doesn't do it now. He's got daughters and he's mellowed out. But I said, what happens when you come out of the raft? He's like, what do you mean when you come out of the raft? He says, of course, or if you come out of the raft, of course, it's when you get back in the raft.
Oh
But
my
I mean, he's
word.
hiking in 3 feet of snow to ice climbing remote Colorado wildernesses. I've got one of my pastors has summited the highest mountains in South America and Africa, and like, so I'm surrounded by people where a thriving life chasing after Jesus with everything you have is is almost like a Walter Mitty, right? It's like
Yeah.
they're living a type of life that, and I just pinch yourself. And the adventures aren't just physical; they're relationally adventurous. They're intellectually curious. Like they're. I one time I got really angry at my pastor. I flipped him the bird and swore at him. I said, I don't agree with your theology today. We were out in the wilderness doing a thing. And so rather than push back, he gathered everybody that was in our group. And he's like, hey, Ryan's got this thing. Is this true? Do I, let's talk about it. Let's go through the filters. What's true here? What's not true? How can we learn from this? That's just opposite. If I had to
Oh
critique my
yeah.
dad in a far less way, like I remember one time in high school or college, my dad dropped I had pictures back from Walmart, back when you used to get the physical, and
Yeah.
he dropped them on the floor. I was like, Dad, why, don't drop my freaking pictures. And he immediately came up and he's like, say that word one more time, you'll be picking your teeth off the floor. It's so what I had was I fell into this environment where the curiosity and the kindness and the adventure was so much more than anything I'd ever experienced that I fell in love with a winsome Jesus.
I am so glad that God gave you that community. It's
Mm.
perfect for you. I just when
Right?
I hear stories like this, it makes me worship God. It makes me realize again how big God is and that he truly cares about each one of us as individuals. He knows how we're wired and he knows what we need and he knows the experiences that we need in order
Mm,
to heal some of those early woundings that we've had in our life.
mhm,
How to how the antidote for some of those things. And
mhm.
I'm so glad that God has given that to you.
Which is funny because when I first started, so I came to this church, having the last English speaking church I've been a part of was an IFB church. And I came every week to this church to prove it wrong. And I remember they're like, hey, we're doing this 8 week study during like on Tuesday nights or whatever it was. And what it looks like to be a member of a healthy church or something like New Testament church or whatever. And I remember my small group leaders at that thing. I'd never heard someone say this in a church. They're saying, hey, we're really struggling to get pregnant. We're considering IVF. We don't know if we have the money for it, because we're on staff at a church here. But we're really having a hard time believing God is good right now. And I never heard anybody say that, right? And then we
Right.
pray to go, God, I want to believe, help my lack of belief. And I've had that
Yes.
in do group, and we were going around a Bible passage, and one of my close friends is like, guys, I really can't unpack this tonight. My wife lost a pregnancy today, and I'm blind to anything that we're talking about. And we just shut the whole thing down and just laid hands on him and prayed over him. And the
Wow.
guy I asked to start the prayer was the guy whose wife had lost a pregnancy 2 or 3 months earlier. And of course, he's praying in tears. We're all like, it's we're all emotional. And so what
Mhm.
I've learned is to lean into the discomfort. And that's because I base jump and bungee jump and I go out on the wings of airplanes while they do aerobatic maneuvers. What I know is that the reward, the adrenal reward, all the other body chemicals we get is in proportion to how scared I am. And that becomes normative to me. So when I'm scared in a spiritual situation or a relational I know at the end of this, if I lean into the fear, there's reward there.
That's beautiful. That's a great analogy. Some of us, I'm thinking of my audience or even me. I don't have a lot of experience with, purposefully putting myself in dangerous situations where I'm going to get that adrenal rush. I don't want to do that. That scares me. But the disadvantage of that is that you don't necessarily know what's on the other end. I've had to learn from all of the emotional and the, just the relational kind of adrenal thing, issue, like dangers. There's relational
I tell people
dangers
it's like
too.
trying to explain to a 7-year-old that they're gonna really like kissing a girl someday, or in your case, kissing a boy.
Yeah.
Like you go, trust me. On the other, it's scary to put yourself out there, do the hitch, lean in 90% or whatever. But it's good time. I was
Yeah,
like,
right,
I
exactly. But you do have to experience, but the more people do lean into, we talk a lot in my program about leaning into pain. Like
mm,
if you run away from pain, you run away from the emotional pain, you fight it or you resist it or you try to buffer it, like, well, I'll solve for this by, overeating or overspending or, sleeping all day or whatever. And you're not willing to just feel the pain and cry and walk through that grieving process, you'll never get to the other side. The only way to the other side, like what you're saying, is to go through it. You have to be willing to experience.
yeah, embrace the suck. I, I
Exactly.
remember the first time I went to therapy, I used to wear an Apple Watch and my resting heart rate was 55 that morning. And I opened the door, walked into the waiting room and sat down. And I looked down at my watch and it was at 83. So I'd gone up
Yeah.
50% heart rate. And I wasn't about to jump off a bridge or off a building. I've done that before. I was about to tell somebody that I was thinking about suicide and that I have a lot of pain in my life. And that was as scary to me as, being upside down in a glider or whatever, crazy thing that I
Yes.
do.
Yes. And that's exactly what I'm saying. The people who are listening to this, the women who are listening to this, that's what the kinds of pain that they're facing. And
And
yeah,
it might
going,
suck for a while, right?
yeah.
Like it might, I've got a buddy right now who's at Buds in Coronado, and that's the school where you train to be a Navy SEAL. And the stuff that he's had to do for the last year and a half, just prepare to do the most ridiculous physical feats to become a Navy SEAL this week or next week when he goes through Hell Week. Uh, like I can't even imagine, right? But you embrace. I remember one of the tests he had to do to even get in was how long can you stand in cold water before you take your feet out? And we're talking ice water.
Oh my
And
word.
he was a minute longer than anybody else. Like, and it was just fine. And fine, the guy's like, hey, you can take your foot out. And my buddy Tanner didn't believe me. He's like, no, 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 you just way surpassed everybody else. And he
Wow.
said to Tanner, he goes, I got to ask you, like, nobody lasts this long in this tank. How are you prepared for it? And Tanner goes, oh, well, I knew this moment was coming. So for the last year and a half, I've taken only cold showers. He
Wow.
embraced the suck for a year and a half for one test because the vision he had of protecting people he cares about as a Navy SEAL was that large in his life. And I think when Jesus becomes that large in our life and we go, being emotionally healthy, spiritually healthy, physically healthy is worth it to get the most I can get out of my relationship with Jesus, it starts to funnel our decisions and make them a little bit easier to make and gives us a little bit
Yes.
more endurance.
Wow. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that story. Okay. So for people who are thinking about, like, let's say that I thought, I think I'm ready to go and visit some churches and look for a place that's going to be healthy. What would you say? What would you say are some things I should be looking for to find a church that's going to be safe for me?
So I know not everybody's going to agree with this, but one of the things I would do is I'm going to go to their website first, regardless, right? And I'm going to see how many women are leadership, not how many women are on stage, how many women are in the room where it happens, right? So
Yes.
recently, we had a situation. There was a guy who served at our church who got found out to be stalking. He was taking a picture of college girls. I live near Liberty University, and he was taking pictures of girls against their volition. They weren't pornographic, but just and our church immediately, the elders called my wife and said, "Here's what we got. How do we know what we have to do, but we also want to know what other things need to be in our messaging, things we need to think about in the process for none of the victims were in our church, but people had seen him around. He'd served prominently in our church. And so the fact that my wife, you look at the website and she's up there. We have a female director of operations. Other churches call it an executive pastor. Like that's just a hint, and that doesn't mean Bill Hybels' church had women in leadership. They even had women elders, right? So that's not a guarantee. That's
Hmm.
a green flag. If I don't see women in leadership, that's one. The
Hmm.
other is, and you may have to go to this church for a little bit to hear this. Is when you hear a teacher say that they've struggled or fallen short or they've changed their mind. That's a big one. If a pastor is willing to say, I used to think X. So on our teaching team at our church, we have multiple voices. And one of the things they do is that if there's whatever the topic is for that Sunday, they kind of look around the team and go, who struggled the most with that? Because they're going to be able to speak most authentically about it. So 2 Sundays ago, we did a whole service on how do Christians handle anxiety? Like, what is the Christian response to the anxiety epidemic in the United States?
Mhm.
And they picked the pastor who's had panic attacks, ended up in the hospital, struggled with anxiety, and said, you go on stage and talk about it, about how hard it is and what you had to learn through the process. So that lets me know if a church is willing to put people on stage and say, here's where I messed up in the past. I made this mistake. I used to think this and now I think that. Um, and then the other one is as I taught. So I would like to, when I first started going to our church, went out to coffee or whatever with people and ask them questions like, and see how they respond to that. If they know everything and they never go, oh, that's a good question. I haven't thought about that. Or, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, are they curious? One of the
Yeah.
pastors at our church, before he was even attended our church, his first service, he came in and he heard a guy on stage talk about how earlier in his life he had struggled with porn, and this was the process of him overcoming his porn addiction. And he goes, I've never been in a church where a pastor told us he had sinned, let alone sexually, right? And he
Wow.
said, I want to go to this church. And he eventually became our executive pastor for like 18 years. He's now a consultant. He travels around and helps businesses now. But for that season, and he said, I ended up here because when I walked into that church, I heard a pastor confessing a problem or a sin or whatever that he'd overcome. Um, it's not a guarantee, right? I mean, I've reported sex
Yeah.
offenders at our church because people walk in that humans walk in that door, and things happen and you have to, I love how our church responds to that, but there's no guarantees in a church. But if you can look for that humility, that curiosity, and the fact that they're going to consult women for decisions, uh, for me, the number one thing is, do women feel like their story will be believed,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
if everything else in your theology says that a woman's voice is worth less than a man's voice, well, that's going to discount when you come forward, which, as you know, in IFB circles in the faith we grew up in, no wonder they don't believe when a victim comes forward because that woman's not allowed to even pray in a church, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's
Exactly.
so I just reverse engineer. So the things that were unhealthy in the church I grew up in, I look for the opposite of that. I'm a response
That's
to that.
that's a good simple way of looking at it actually. When I think about the church that excommunicated me, it wasn't just me being a truth teller. There were actually a lot of people who stood
Mm,
up and tried to tell the truth to all of the white male pastors that were, that were in leadership, and they didn't listen.
mm,
They didn't listen. They vilified everyone that came forward. They
mhm.
made them out to be these bad, horrible sinner people.
You're
And
hurting the
so
gospel.
exactly. And so there were just fraction after fraction after fraction, and and then groups of people would just leave, and then they didn't care because the new people with the young kids would come in, the naive, you know, people who didn't have who had no idea what was going on in that church. Well, they just keep coming in and they just replenish themselves with new blood and get their money from the new blood. It's so gross.
It sounds like vampires, but that's
It
basically what
it
it is.
is. That's exactly it. That's a really good way of putting it. Okay, tell us about your book. I mean, you've talked a little bit about, but I want to hear, like, why did you write tell us the name of it. I will definitely put a link to it. Tell us
Oh, awesome.
why you wrote it and then what exactly it is.
Yeah, so it's hurt and healed by the church, redemption and reconstruction after spiritual abuse. And I keyed off of Diane Langberg says all abuse is spiritual abuse, which I really like
Mm,
that. So
yes.
everything falls under that. But so the first 2 chapters talks about like, here's my backstory. This is what I learned. This is my story. And then the rest of the book, what it does is each chapter takes something malignant that I was taught that enabled abuse to happen. So what I do is I say this is an improper belief that's taught in churches in the United States, and this is how that leads to abuse. And then as you go through the chapter, you get to the end. It's like, and here's what Jesus actually said, and here's what the Bible actually says about that, and how e- everything that is in the Bible is antithetical to abuse, right? Like you can use the Bible for abuse, just like you can use it for all kinds of stuff.
Yep.
And so that's most of it. And then the last 2 chapters is about the power of telling our stories. And so I talk about what happens when we tell our stories, what's happened since I've told my story, and I tell the redemption story of the adoption process of my daughter. That's how it closes. In fact, one of my
Mm,
dad's victims said when she finished reading the advanced copy, she said when she passes out the book, she's going to tell people read the last chapter first and see the redemption, and then go back and read all the hard stuff.
oh,
But
that's
the reason I wrote it is in some ways a response to my last book. So it's Scared to Life. I was challenging people to lean into their fears because you can't have faith unless you have doubt, fear, or both. And so if the just shall live by faith, we have to lean into our fears. And what was interesting is the feedback that I got from people was that they didn't go skydiving or bungee jumping or whatever. It gave them the courage to be vulnerable with another person. I was like,
mm,
wow, like that wasn't the goal of that book at all. I was
yeah.
trying to get people to go explore the physical kingdom of God. But and so what if I could tell my story and get people to be vulnerable and tell their story, right? To report, what's happened to them, or to find their way before something happens, find their way to a safe church before they have a story to tell.
Mm.
And so throughout, basically, you can go chapter by chapter and say, hey, if a church is espousing this, it's not going to be a safe place.
Right,
For the
right.
most part, not all of them, but for most of those, I would say, at least 50% of the chapters, if your church is espousing this, you're going to be wanting to keep your head on the swivel. And so, what I tried to do was redeem all these different lanes of false teaching and connect them to abuse, and then teach them how God has redeemed those.
I love that. Can you give us just one example of just one teaching that you talk about in your book that you don't have to tell us the antidote, but just like what's one of the bad
Ye-
teachings that you wanted to turn around?
So, I'll just pick one that's easier because some of them are very new. I have a couple chapters that are almost 4,000 words because they're so nuanced. But we've been taught correctly in most churches that Jesus wants it to be on earth as it is in heaven. That's the right thing. And I said, have you ever thought that anger won't be part of heaven? There's no anger in heaven. And so what I talk about is how a church that glorifies anger, and you and I have been in those churches, right? That where a pastor who's angry is anointed and he's gifted of God and whatever. And what I show is actually it's the opposite of that. And a lot of angry Christians like to point to Jesus in the temple cracking the whip. I was like, wait. Let's look at that. So first of all, he created everything. If he was so angry, he could Thanos snap and everything's gone. There's no molecules left. Two, he didn't do this more than once. He walked in there and he didn't rough anybody up. We don't hear of him physically attacking anybody. He cracked the whip.
Yeah.
He never deputized his disciples to say, hey, why don't you make some whips? Let's go in here. He never said, go and do thou likewise. And on the Romans road that I was taught, and you were probably taught in IFB churches, the first verse is, there is none righteous, no, not one. So there is no such thing as righteous anger. And so there is justice, right? And Jesus said, let me take care of vengeance, which I actually like, that he's the only one that can have holy vengeance. And he promised, he's like, I'm good. I got you. I'm going to take care of this. And so even something as benign as anger is, but I go through sexual ethics of the silencing of women. I go through what I learned about even race relations, like what I was taught about Black people being inferior to us. Obviously, that was utterly trashed by having a Black daughter. But I'll go through all these different things of how we talk about victims. There's a whole chapter of it's called a denial of dignity, of like even how we talk about people who have been harmed lets people know whether or not they're safe in a church.
Wow, that's interesting. I want to give a caveat about anger for people because when I've talked about anger on my podcast before, because a lot of times victims will feel very one of the emotions that actually helps them to get out is anger.
Sure.
Because because they deny and they play, they really deny their experience to try to keep calm so they can stay and keep all of the, keep the house of cards intact, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes, at least for me, my experience was I finally got so angry that I was like, I'm not doing this anymore. But I needed that anger was like a fuel to
Mm-hmm.
get me
It
to
was a
not be so
catalyst.
scared, like to get past the fear and the shame. And then I have a book out too that I just published called All the Scary Little Gods. So but
Mm,
I talk in that book about how eventually the anger, once I did get out, eventually the anger gets old.
mhm,
It gets weary to carry
mm,
that kind
mm.
of.
Mhm.
that burden. And so there's a place for it, but
But that
you're
place isn't
right.
on stage, right? It shouldn't
No,
be the
no.
right. That place isn't from the
Exactly.
people who are in charge. That
Exactly. You're talking about the anger that you're talking about is what people use because they're mad and they want to control everyone.
Mhm.
They say that it's God. God's angry. And so, that you guys are all being sinners. And so God's anointed me to spread, to show you
It's
how
Mark
angry he
Driscoll, it's
is.
Greg Locke, it's political pundits, it's the
Yes.
talk radioification of the church.
Yes, exactly.
Everybody has a hot take, everybody is pissed off all the time, um,
Exactly.
and that's not Jesus's modus operandi, right? Like,
No, it's not. But so that's very different than the anger. And I'm only saying that for listeners who might be like, oh dear, now I feel angry. Maybe eh, I feel like
well, and anger is a
victims.
secondary emotion, right? So you don't feel angry first. Anger is the second thing. You feel embarrassed, you feel hurt, I mean, there's all
Yes.
types of things that lead to anger. And so what happens is anger will burn. It's kind of like kindling on a fire. It'll burn out and then it lights the stuff that lets you start to deal with the real what's the thing below. Like a lot of anger is in the IFB world that is performative, right? It's
Yeah.
like the basketball players that will go and read like hateful tweets about them before the game to get that extra boost of adrenaline to go out and score 40 points. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
it's a performance enhancer. It's not
Yeah.
even real. I think that's different than us feeling things. Now we still confess it to Jesus, say, listen, I'm feeling angry. What do I do with this? Anger should lead us to ask the question, what do I do with what I'm feeling?
Right. It's like someone had described it like a dashboard of a car. It's a
It's a
flashing
warning light.
light to give you
Mhm.
information about what's going on with your car. So there's
Mhm.
something going on inside of me. Why do I feel angry? I'll link to a podcast episode for listeners. I did a podcast episode called "The Three Sources of Anger," and
Mm,
I can't remember what the last part of the title is, but I'll link to it. If anyone is like wondering about anger or wants to learn, it's only my thoughts about anger because I have struggled with that. But I really do. And I did have, so in one of the churches that I went to, not the one that excommunicated me, but a different one where one of the pastors had a very angry persona on stage
mm,
at times. And, I, looking back, this was an abusive person. Okay. So
mm.
I really think that abuse, and even like a lot of these women who are listening, they have husbands who are very angry people and take out their anger on their kids or take out their anger on their wives. But it's not, and then say that it's in the name of God or that it's righteous
Mhm.
anger, but it's not. It's anger that you're not doing things my way. You didn't keep the kids quiet. You didn't keep the kids sitting quiet in church. And now, and what's really internally motivated by is like, what do I look like? Are
Embarrassment,
people
insecurity.
respecting me because I'm amazeballs and my family has to be in order and my family has to be well behaved? It's all about image and image management
Mhm,
and what can I get out? What can I squeeze out of this church or out of these people
mhm.
to make me look good and feel good and manage my life?
Yeah,
So,
what for a healthy person, anger is like you said, a warning light. It's a thing, it's a trigger for us in a curious way. For
yes,
people who are performatively angry, it's not. And I think those are two different things, right? And I love the fact that the only time that Jesus even got that angry publicly was when people were making it harder to follow him, right?
yes,
So,
yes.
not that we should stay torqued off. I even have to put boundaries. I follow a lot of truth teller Instagram and YouTube, whatever podcast accounts, right? I financially support the Royce Report and others. And I found that there are certain times that I have to turn off the feeds or move
Yeah.
those emails because it can go to an unhealthy anger.
Yep. I
Um,
agree.
so I
I
think
totally
there's good
agree.
and bad to it. If it does burn, it should burn real short and it should burn us towards a curious ending.
Yeah. I often talk about Matthew 23, where Jesus says hard things to the Pharisees. He says a lot of really, he calls them like
Whitewash
broods of
tombs.
vipers. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Again, his point is, and we don't know his tone of voice when he was saying it, but we do know that his point was, you're putting heavy burdens on people, and that's not my heart. The heart of God is to set people free from those heavy burdens.
That's right.
And that's why I'm here to show you God's love and kindness and compassion. It's the kindness that leads us to repentance. It's not
Say that
fire
louder.
and
That's right.
brimstone. Yeah. And beating people up. Yeah. So, well, this has been a great conversation. I'm so glad that, that you came on as a guest. I'm glad that I get a lot of requests for people, and I don't always know, if I don't know somebody, it's kind of a crapshoot to whether or not it's going to be, what kind of interview it's going to be. So I was a little nervous about this one because I've never met you. I didn't read your book, although now I want to read it.
Thanks.
So I'm so glad that you came on, though. I think this was a beautiful interview, and I'm so thankful that you are telling your story. I
Mm.
hope that there's justice for your
Same.
dad, and
Same.
and even for your mom. I'm concerned about your mom, of course,
Mm.
because that's who I work with, women of faith who are in abusive marriages. But also realizing that women get to make their own choices, and
That's
they
right.
also have autonomy and can decide for themselves what is best
Mhm.
for them. But um I'm so glad that your life is that you've moved into your flow,
Mm.
that you have a beautiful daughter and wife that are supportive of
Mm.
you, and you're supportive of them. And
Mm.
that's amazing. You've got an amazing testimony. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Oh man, thanks for giving me the opportunity to share it with more people.
Yeah.